Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 7. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Chris. And our goal in this episode is to explore the significance of one of the most notorious sets of images within the book of Revelation.
Or anywhere.
Yeah. The mark of the beast and the number of the beast. We will begin by exploring some of the more unhelpful and yet unfortunately fairly common types of popular assumptions that tend to surround the language and imagery of the number and the mark associated with this beast figure. And then we will seek to unpack some of the more likely and more helpful and more responsible ways of understanding some of the historical allusions and the political commentary and even the theological implications that are likely intended by these images within their own historical context. What we will find is that, yet again, the book is not intended to obscure, but to reveal. Mm-hmm. And it's not intended so much to predict some kind of strange future chronological or sequential series of events, but rather to reveal something that matters in a way that transcends, that makes sense within its own historical context, but also transcends it so that it encourages and provokes faithful worship and faithful discipleship in every generation of Christians. So our hope is that we can help to situate these images and this language in its historical context as a way of demystifying these images so that we can see how they fit into the book of Revelation and its own consistent message, but also how these images are ultimately intended to shape our own faithful discipleship today instead of compromise or complacency, and our own faithful worship today instead of idolatry or other forms of compromise. So as many of us know, these images, this language of taking or having the mark of the beast or somehow knowing something about what the number of the beast is and whether one should be worried about it or scared of it or aware of it in some capacity, these have found their way into popular culture in all sorts of ways. And so there are all sorts of assumptions and convictions that people might bring to a text like Revelation, and specifically passages that talk about the mark of the beast or the number of the beast, like chapter 13, chapter 17, some of the other places in the book. The hope is that our discussion today will bring about at least some clarity with regard to what the author probably intended to communicate and what the original audience probably would have understood by the use of this language and these images. And ultimately, so as to seek to discern and understand how these images might continue to speak even to followers of Jesus today in our own context. We've been emphasizing throughout these conversations, especially recently, the importance of taking into account the original context within which Revelation was written and initially circulated, in order to avoid simply reading our own assumptions into the text. When it comes to the mark of the beast and the number of the beast, as I said, these are perhaps two of the most notorious images from the book, and folks tend to and have historically come up with all sorts of interesting interpretations related to them. So Chris, maybe to begin, to start us off here, in your opinion and in your experience, what are some of the more interesting or some of the strangest and perhaps even most unhelpful assumptions and interpretations folks have come up with?
Yeah, I imagine that there is a great deal of commentary from leaders of the past in their journaling and records of the ways in which those that they were relating to how they were applying the mark of the beast. But for us, yeah, I've seen some real creative application of late. For instance, early on in our regathering after COVID, right? We didn't hold public services for 3 months, and then we began to hold public services with some serious and significant limitations, with the idea being the protection of life. And so one of those things was the taking of temperatures at the door and simply, noting that you registered. And so there was the idea that we were participating in government contact tracing, which we weren't doing at all. But we had one gentleman who, as we, attempted to just quickly take his temperature, he lost it. And he said that we were participating in the mark of the beast, which I think meant that contact tracing was like the loss of a civil liberty, or that our government, like the big brother kind of dynamic, that was somehow attached to the mark of the beast, or was itself the mark of the beast, that this individual had been reading this biblical text and had found this to be, this is that. Okay, we are in this moment of life, and this is what the mark of the beast is. So while that was very surprising to me and disheartening, to be honest with you, it's far from the only application that we've seen. I think the most common that I hear of is the idea, because we read in Revelation that the mark of the beast would be something that would be attached to business, commerce, the buying and selling of goods, right? So I think we most readily move towards something around like a chip. So there's this idea that we were going to move to a cashless society, and that we'll be implanted with chips, and that will be something like the mark of the beast. And I think I'm not suggesting that we won't ever have chips in us. Who knows? And nor am I suggesting that we will eventually be a cashless society. Certainly the trends are towards, I use cash less today than I have at any point in my life. I'm not mocking any of that. But there is this idea attached to the mark of the beast that somehow we are going to stumble into receiving the mark of the beast without fully knowing it. Like, there's just this real fear, like, I have to know what the mark of the beast is. And of course, ... that's a literal thing that I'm a literal thing that I'm going to have on my body. And what if I take them? I've had people ask me, what if I take the mark of the beast and I don't even know it? Well, in that construct, that's actually a better question than they think.
Sure.
That is a better question than they know, because all they're asking about is a chip or a mark on their body. But really, as we, over the next few minutes, talk about the mark of the beast, what is it? And what if I actually do participate in it and I don't even know it? That's actually a really good question, just not in the context they're asking it, right?
Yeah.
What John was going after was something quite a bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's helpful to note that, as you were sort of unpacking some of these examples, and probably many of us are aware of other similar scenarios where either people just in conversation or in our own sort of circles, or even people with maybe a more sort of public profile over the years, over the generations, have sometimes speculated, what exactly will this be? What will it look like? This kind of thing. I haven't watched the Left Behind films or read the books. I probably should, in order to just understand this framework better.
Yeah.
But my guess is that within those contexts, there would be a fairly specific interpretation of what it looks like, what it's going to be like, that kind of thing. But I think at the very least, what we should recognize in line with the conversations we've been having in this podcast is that an approach to interpreting any aspect of this book, whether it's the mark and the number of the beast or any other component of it, an approach that just gravitates sort of automatically in a knee-jerk kind of way toward futurist assumptions, as if the whole point of this book was to predict some kind of future sequence of events, and an approach that just automatically, again, in a sort of knee-jerk assumption kind of way, just sort of takes for granted or assumes that this must be something that will literally happen. Both of those sets of assumptions are failing to take seriously so many of the things that we've tried to convey the importance of over the course of these conversations, right? The notion that in order to understand our scriptures well, wisely, responsibly, it will make sense to think about the genre of the text. What kind of document is this? What might an author have been trying to communicate by using that kind of genre? What is the specific context and situation in which this text emerged? And is it possible that learning a little bit about the context and frame of reference and even the things people would have taken for granted in that context might be a much better guide for understanding what this book means and intends to convey than just importing my own assumptions or my immediate observations about the world around me into or onto the text. So if we were to sort of try to recognize that a basic or simplistic futurist assumption is maybe not the most helpful, and assuming that every bit of language or imagery in the book should be understood literally is probably not the best set of assumptions. If we keep in mind some of the things we've discussed so far, how might thinking about genre and context and some of these things that we've unpacked help us to set a framework for understanding this sort of beast imagery and language?
Yeah, I mean, there's enough fear attached to this that we can just go wild in our imaginations. But let's never forget the purpose of the text. John was writing not about a future, potentially chronological prediction, some predictive code that we somehow so many centuries removed could make sense of. He was not writing with that in mind at all, like not even a little bit. He was writing to people he knew, churches that he seemingly had relationship with if he wasn't overtly responsible for them as a pastor. And he was writing to help them follow Jesus. He was writing to aid their discipleship. He was writing to aid their faithful witness in their moment. And the mere fact that we can derive value for the end from it is part of the brilliance of the book. I mean, John's method to madness, if you will, is that he reminds them of where this is all going to inform their moment, because their moment is very sincere and challenging in whatever specific manifestation that it is. And then I think it's also really important for us to remember that John, as some preachers like to say, it's not like John had bad pizza one night and woke up the next morning and had a dream and went, man, let me make sense of this. Like, John's steeped in the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, he is absolutely steeped in the prophets. They're like really good friends. And so he is utilizing a lot of background from the Hebrew scriptures to communicate this imagery. So he's not making this stuff up. Really what he's doing is he's borrowing and he's assigning significant symbolism to this imagery. And even the symbolism, he's not making that up. Like he's like repurposing so much. He is a great repackager, if you will.
Yeah,
I don't even know if that's a right word.
Yeah, I like that.
But he's repackaging so much, and he's just gleaning from so many original sources to help communicate this. And isn't it helpful? I just know that as a pastor, that I know that my words don't carry the authority to change anyone's life. But I do believe that God's words, trusted and true over the many, many centuries, that God's words, by the Spirit, do have the ability to bring transformation. I just wonder if John had that same idea. Like, I'm taking imagery from what we trust is at the point that he was at God's authoritative word to his people. And let me repackage that to help you in your moment. Yeah. And then there is these various genres that are at play in this writing, which we've already visited, right? Prophetic, the fact that it's a letter to specific people in specific places, and that it is apocalyptic literature, which was a very significant genre type of the day, and therefore John felt permission to lean into it. Again, it wasn't like this was alien to the people who were receiving this. They would read, they would be exposed to apocalyptic literature or stories, even depictions of it dramatically, right, in the Roman world. So John is just, he's full on leaning into, man, I'm using everything at my disposal to help you right now. And I think one of the things that's going to help you is remembering where this is all going. And remembering how layered this is. There's an ancient evil and malice that has arrayed itself against God. And oh, by the way, shows up in your everyday life. And then there's this ancient cosmic good who made you and who was for you and has made himself available to you in a child that emerged from a woman, right? His people. So we're going back to Revelation 12. So John is just leaning in and using everything at his disposal to help these people he cares about. That's very, very important. And therefore, that builds a bridge for us as we are talking very specifically about the mark of the beast and the number associated with the beast. Because gosh, once we see this in context, it's a game changer. So that's my question to you, John, is help us see the mark and the number more in the context of the moment.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, the way you've set that up is helpful to remind ourselves of not only the genre and the context, but also something we talked about early on in these conversations, John's sort of deeply practical pastoral intent. I think if we combine an awareness of genre, some awareness of context, and remind ourselves over and over that the point of the book is not sort of obscure, fanciful, sort of prophetic speculation about something that will happen in the future that has no bearing on John's day and John's audience. But if we remind ourselves, the goal of this whole thing is to promote genuine worship of the one true God instead of all rivals, and faithful allegiance and faithful witness to Jesus in the context of potential difficulty and compromise. If we remind ourselves over and over of that, then that should go a long way toward avoiding some of the more fanciful and strange interpretations of these images. One of the first things I think to recognize about the mark of the beast, we've been talking about context over these past few conversations, and as we've especially focused on historical context being important. But as many readers of the Bible know, literary context is important too. And so it can be helpful to note that this notion of receiving a mark for some reason is not entirely new in the context of the book of Revelation, or it doesn't sort of occur independently. In fact, it seems to be one of many contrasts or juxtapositions within the book, where in chapter 7, we see this vision of the people of God being sealed and kind of protected for God and by God. And we have the seal sort of occurring on the forehead. And so even though we have different language, the Greek term for seal and the Greek term for mark here are different ones, we clearly have very similar kinds of images that seem to be being contrasted. Images that speak of the identity of certain people, the sort of allegiance to whom these people belong, and ultimately these ideas of worship and discipleship come to the fore. And so the mark of the beast is not an image that just occurs on its own in chapter 13 and is just sort of like, well, that's a strange thing to all of a sudden bring up. Rather, it's part of a series of contrasts. We talked in our last conversation about the dragon and the two beasts as this sort of counterfeit trinity. So we have God and the Lamb and the seven spirits as a kind of triune manifestation in the book of Revelation, and then this counterfeit Trinity in contrast. We've talked about the figure of Babylon as this important symbolic entity that communicates sort of empire set up in opposition to God, which we will see contrasted with the city of the New Jerusalem. So we have all sorts of additional examples of this throughout the book. It's a very sort of dualistic framework. It sets up dichotomies or juxtapositions in order to communicate that ultimately, from the perspective of a book like Revelation, no one's just neutral. No one can just say, oh yeah, I might worship, I might not. I'm just going to go about my daily life. Rather, everybody worships. Everybody worships something or someone all of the time. The question is, what or whom do you worship? And that's the same thing that we recognize, many of us, about our own lives today. It's not as if we just go about our lives and then every once in a while worship Jesus in some kind of way. Every aspect of our lives involves some kind of set of patterns or processes or sort of habits, even what you might call liturgies, that expose or reveal what it is that we truly worship. And so a helpful way to think about this sort of essential contrast between those who are faithful to Jesus being sealed by and for him, and those who are devoted to the beast being marked for that purpose and in a way that sort of reveals that purpose, is one sort of crucial aspect to it. Then if we kind of think a little bit about, again, one way of reading a biblical book is to sort of read it and think and gravitate toward my own frame of reference and my own assumptions and just go, oh, what might a mark like that look like? Maybe a tattoo, maybe some kind of branding situation, I don't know. But if we interpret a text like this in its context, and if we think back to, if John, like many other authors of the New Testament, is a Jewish author, and as you were just articulating, Chris, he's steeped in the Hebrew Bible, the imagery, the language, the theology. If we think a little bit about sort of where have we seen this language of being marked or sealed or this kind of thing before, we can actually see a pattern that exists sort of throughout the Hebrew Bible. If we look right back near the beginning, we see this notion of being sort of sealed for protection or marked for protection in the story of Cain, who's cast out of God's presence, but ultimately is marked for protection, suggesting something about his sort of his identity and belonging still to God in some kind of a way. If we look at the book of Exodus, we see that the high priest in the high priestly garments bears the name of Yahweh upon his garments, and also bears the name of the 12 tribes of Israel on his garments, speaking about sort of the identity of the covenant people and the function of this representative who facilitates the worship, the faithful worship of the covenant people. If we look at the priestly blessing in Numbers chapter 6, there's this language of the nation of Israel as a whole bearing the name of Yahweh. And if we look at Deuteronomy 6, this famous passage referred to as the Shema, we have precisely this language of certain words associated with the worship and the worship of God and covenant faithfulness to God being bound on the forehead and on the wrists of the covenant people. And so if we sort of allow that set of images and those kinds of traditions to sort of inform what we think someone like John, this Jewish Christian fellow, might be saying to these communities that are Christian but also steeped in Jewish tradition, it just makes all the sense in the world that we would start to think through the possible resonances for how being sort of marked on the forehead and on the wrist, or marked on the forehead or the wrist, might have all kinds of symbolic and metaphorical associations with who or what one truly worships. So that perhaps the most helpful thing would not be to sort of speculate about some kind of physical, literal mark that's, like you said, is just sort of going to appear out of nowhere, and people had no idea it was coming, or they just weren't, diligent enough to avoid that new development in society. And now, oh shoot, now I've got the mark. That kind of thing. Rather, it seems to be a part of the overall rhetorical or communicative strategy of a book like this that's designed to unveil, to disclose. You've talked many times in your sermons about how this apocalypse language is all about peeling back the curtain. You like the image of peeling the curtain back, like in a play, you see what's behind it. I've always liked the image too of lifting off the lid, like those those covers that they would have on like over a plate at a fancy restaurant like an old-fashioned restaurant. Lifting the lid off.
That's another good one.
And I think both of those are good images, but the one other thing we need to add to it is that often an apocalypse is not just, oh, the curtains are pulled back and there's the actors, or the lid is lifted off and there's the food. The food that I more or less expected is there. But it's actually, it very often involves a sort of exposing of the true nature of things.
Oh, so good.
Right? So in that sense, it's maybe more like those old Mission Impossible movies where one of the characters looks like it's a certain person, but then they sort of tear the fake face off. And it has that kind of element to it very often, the apocalyptic rhetoric or the apocalyptic symbolism. And so very likely the intent of this marking imagery is meant to contrast the people of God who are sealed by and for God, because they worship him, because they follow Jesus, because their allegiance is to the Lamb, and those who, on the basis of the patterns of life that they've chosen and what it is that they worship and what kinds of political and economic and cultural systems they've determined to devote their lives to, this marking image reveals who it is they truly belong to, what it is they truly worship, and where their allegiance truly lies. So
that would seemingly communicate something obvious to the readers, correct? Like, those who have the mark of the beast, who worship the beast, who have decided that their allegiance and loyalty will be to the beast, which inherently then suggests that the beast has something to do not with a literal figure, but a system that has been made manifest in Roman rule and commerce and imperial might and economic influence, that this is where you've thrown your lot. And the worshipers of the beast, those who have received the mark, that's obvious. It's also obvious those who haven't, those who don't throw their allegiance there, but throw their allegiance to the one true God. So that helps me as a pastor, and I hope it helps people hearing this wrestle with sort of this nebulous thing, like, am I going to participate in the receiving of this and not know it? The answer to that is definitively not. You either participate in that system and throw your allegiance there, or you don't, or you don't. But then, John, there's more that's fascinating about the number, correct? I mean,
certainly.
This is part of my favorite thing here. I mean, tell us about the number, because this is good.
And this is probably one of the places. I mean, I think Chris and Trevor in the sermon series, and the two of and all three of us as well in these podcast conversations, we've repeatedly tried to emphasize, we don't want to treat Revelation as some kind of secret code that you just need to line up all of the things and then the sort of prediction of what's going to happen in the future will become clear. And yet, perhaps some have noticed in the course of our conversations that there certainly are components to the book that do function in some sense like a code or a symbol, an image that's intended to convey something in a non-literal fashion by kind of saying. And I mean, the author even sort of signals to us, right? This sort of let the reader understand. There's this breaking of the fourth wall kind of thing, right? Where we have this sort of reference to the number. I mean, the first thing to recognize is if we have at all convinced anybody that in the course of this conversation so far, that the most helpful way to think about what these beasts are is this sort of symbolic expression of the particular manifestation of anti-God imperial rule that is Rome, but also is it sort of fits the bill of any sort of empire that functions in this way. And if it makes sense to think of this notion of being either marked or sealed for the worship of the one true God and allegiance to Jesus, or for the worship of the beast and allegiance to Rome and to the empire and to this particular manifestation of beastly power, then of course it makes some sense to think, well, maybe this number is somehow associated with that reality.
Yeah.
And the more we kind of look into it here with the help of many biblical scholars who've done the work, it's not like Chris and I sort of sat down and hashed all this out and are presenting it to you for the first time.
Don't give that away, John.
But what a number of scholars have really helpfully shown is that this is very likely a coded sort of side reference to Nero, who was one of the important emperors prior to Domitian, who was probably the emperor at the time the book was written. There was an ancient practice in using the Hebrew language that was fairly well known called gematria. And this was a way of using the Hebrew language to communicate not only linguistic significance, how letters are used to form words and sentences, but also attaching numerical significance to the Hebrew alphabet. So that various letters in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, those are the first four sort of characters within the Hebrew alphabet. Each one of them would be assigned a numerical value that would be known. And so one could use the words and letters to communicate either linguistic significance or numerical significance. A little bit like how our phones, we don't really do it anymore because texting is sort of easier, but early on with texting, you could use, the numbers on the phone would also have three letters associated with them, right? It's a little bit like that kind of thing. And it was a common enough practice that there are even examples that they've discovered in caves and stuff of people using this in a basic sort of graffiti kind of way to say, I don't remember the actual numbers from this example, but it's something like, the boy whose number is 856 loves the girl whose number is 323, or something along those lines.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit like how someone might carve their initials into a tree in our own context. But it shows that this was a common way of sort of understanding how the language could be used with words and sentences, but could also have this sort of veiled or thinly veiled sort of numerical significance. And one could speak about things in this way. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but when you take the Greek name for Nero, Neron Kaiser, and then you transliterate it into its Hebrew characters, so you sort of use the Hebrew language to denote the Greek name with the two names, Nero, Caesar. What you get using this ancient form of this sort of ancient literary device, gematria, is 666. And so that alone is highly suggestive that what the author was trying to do was refer to this particular figure. Now, there is also, if you imagine an alphabet with all sorts of number combinations, there are all sorts of other things that 666 might be used to sort of add up to. So people have proposed other things. One of the really interesting things that has convinced many people that this is probably meant to be a reference to Nero is that there's a textual variant. So for many of the biblical texts that we have, even though we just have them in our Bibles sitting there are numerous versions of the ancient documents that scholars will use to sort of come up with which one seems to best represent the sort of faithful manuscript tradition, which one is probably the most likely sort of version of this original text. Every once in a while, we have textual variants, so little variations in the available manuscript versions of our New Testament documents, for example. There are ancient manuscripts that instead of 666 have 616, and another version of Nero's name, I think without the final noon on the Nero part, come out to 616. And so when you put sort of all of that evidence together, it seems like a very likely the case that what John is trying to do is make a reference to this particular leader within the Roman Empire that he has already referred to, most likely in some of the imagery associated with the beast and the particular horns that come off of the beast. And but he's making a particular kind of reference that's intended to signify the role that this figure played within the context of this imperial rule. The one final element that I think is also worth keeping in mind, I suppose some might think of this as an alternative explanation, but I think it's entirely possible that this could be just another aspect of what John is trying to communicate, is we've noted over and over the deep symbolic and theological significance of the number 7. And if you imagine sevens being lined up with one another, the way that in some sense they kind of are at times in the book, it communicates a sense of wholeness and completeness and fulfillment. And so perhaps there's also something symbolically significant about this number being associated with beastly, anti-God, anti-Christ type power, or expressions of power and idolatry and blasphemy and injustice that falls short in the fullest possible way of completeness and wholeness and goodness. It's just sort of it's like the, only ever hearing a leading tone in music and never the resolution of the melody. It's like something that falls short of what ought to be in every possible way.
Wow. That is really well said and helpful. Thank you. Anything else you want to add about the mark or the number before we bring this episode to its conclusion?
Yeah, I think the helpful thing here is probably just to reiterate something that we've already talked a little bit about, which is that even when John's intention seems to be to make a fairly specific reference to someone like Nero or to particular components or aspects of the Roman Empire, the point is not just to say, yeah, Nero was a pretty bad guy. Isn't it great he's not around anymore? Or, Rome's pretty bad. Wouldn't it be great if we could overthrow them and we could just sort of do our own thing? But rather the point is to expose something about the consistent, ancient, and likely future manifestations of this kind of idolatrous power that claims that it's good for everybody, that claims to bring about order and peace and wealth and security and all of these kinds of things. But actually, when it's exposed for what it really is, it claims essentially to be God, to be Lord and Savior. It demands allegiance and wholehearted devotion in the same way, in terms of what ultimately belongs only to Jesus. And it tends to perpetuate violence and injustice and dehumanization while promoting itself through various forms of propaganda as being of good for all people. And so I think, again, we need to remind ourselves that the point is to expose something that is a particular historical manifestation of human arrogance, distorted forms of human power and political influence. But ultimately, it participates in a broader pattern throughout human history that we should potentially be able to recognize among and around us today as well, and that it participates in a deeply sort of spiritual entity that actually sort of is behind and within each human manifestation of this kind of thing. And so ultimately, what the beast imagery as a whole in a book like Revelation is designed to do, what this language about being aware of the mark of the beast, being aware of the number of the beast, what all of it is designed to do is not to sort of scare us about something that might happen one day that we need to sort of be on the lookout for in futurist, literalistic kinds of terms, but to invite us in each and every generation, in each and every culture, in each and every even daily situation as followers of Jesus, to be aware of the potential temptations toward the compromise of our faithful worship of the one true God and our faithful allegiance to the Lamb, and to avoid all compromise as we instead persist in our faithful witness to Jesus.
Thank you, John. That was very helpful. Hope very much that you have enjoyed learning around the mark of the beast and the specific number attached, 666. So, thanks for joining us. We look forward to spending some more time with you here very shortly in future podcast episodes.
Yeah, thanks for listening. This episode, as they all have been so far, was edited by Tim Muchira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and our music is from Sherry Muchira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4us.org for more.